there's things happening to play catch up. And yeah, of course, there's so much we have to catch up with right now. What exactly is happening? What's going on in the education system right now? What steps
So,
have they been
yeah.
taken?
So the government produced a piece of guidance that it isn't statutory until September. I think I'm right with that. But basically, it is a curriculum that, well, it's not a curriculum, it's a set of outcomes that young people need to have achieved at different stages in their education. So there are some that are earmarked as having to have been taught and delivered before the end of primary, and some that are intended to be taught before the end of the secondary phase of education. Now, the primary ones completely eschewed the actual mechanics of sex, sexual relationships in a direct manner. So, in the primary content, you're looking at things like what healthy relationships are. Now, that could be a relationship between friends, it could be a relationship between kind of boyfriends and girlfriends without alluding to it directly. It can be relationships between parents, families, just what an appropriate relationship is, what beginning to go into kind of what an exploitative relationship looks like.
Okay.
Now, for me, my issue with it is I think it's too late to leave that proper conversation about what an exploitative relationship looks like, what an inappropriate relationship looks like. I think it's too late to leave it till secondary school when you're actually being explicit about what you really mean by
Yeah.
that. Because, we do want children to have well-developed social skills and, to know if a friend's a bad friend. That's important, of course, but thinking about their own vulnerability, children are kind of they become we already know from psychology that children are sexual creatures anyway. We just don't like to think of them as that because it seems inappropriate to us as adults. But they're becoming more sexualized, or at least more switched on to sexualization from a much younger age, primarily because of the media they're exposed to now. So I kind of feel like it's too late to wait until they're 11 or 12 to sort of talk about, you need to be careful about how you present yourself. Do you want to be perceived in a certain way? Presenting yourself in one way can lead to another consequence that you don't realize. I mean, I think back to this example I'll give of trying to take photographs for a wall display of my class about 4 or 5 years ago, and it was an early years class, so that puts the children at an age between 4 and 5 years old. And most of the children were happy just to kind of like stand against a wall, do a cute sort of smile, and I'd take the photograph for our birthdays display. And this one child, a little girl, would not accept that pose as a photograph. She wanted to kind of do that, drop the shoulder, turn, pout, look down. And I
Oh,
just kind of
wow.
said,
How old was she?
she was 4 and some months, I don't quite remember, but she was less than 5. And I said, you don't need to do that. We're just taking a nice photo so we can, see our faces when we come into the classroom, and we know when our birthdays are, and we can use it to learn different things. She was like, no, I really need it to be like this. This is how mummy does it. And I remember thinking, well, that's the beginning of that journey for some children. Now, she's been exposed to that kind of Instagram, kind of like, no judgment here, but lip filler, eyebrows in the particular shape, perhaps some cosmetic procedures, perhaps not wearing very many clothes. She's been exposed to that kind of like sexualization of women. And she's kind of taken that on board as being the norm, something that she wants to aspire to, which on the one hand is problematic, I feel, because it possibly isn't appropriate for a 4-year-old to want to kind of present themselves in that way to the world. But on the other hand, it's what a lot of children will be seeing and be interested in pursuing, because all of their role models in the media, well, not all, but a lot of the role models to be observing in the media will have that presentation. And I think that it's all very well and good saying we don't need to teach children to be aware of that until a later point, but it's already too late for some children. Like some children at age 6, 7, 8, 9, they're already kind of invested in that kind of pre-sexual behavior, in the sense that they're making those presentational choices, those behavioral choices, without necessarily having contextualized it or having the knowledge that the one relates to the other. And I
Yeah.
think
So,
allowing those children to be in a vulnerable position by not kind of having that conversation.
yeah. So, just to clarify, you mean that in primary school they also been thought about like an appropriate and inappropriate relationships. So I definitely agree that that's too late, because we know that a lot of sexual abuse happens to children from a much younger age, and they should be you know, being, I mean, parents tell the kids nowadays from a younger age, you know, that no one should be touching you here, this shouldn't be
Yeah.
happening. So definitely they need
Well,
this.
that is taught. I should add that is
Okay.
taught from a very young age. That, you know,
Okay.
right, there's a private zone that shouldn't be touched. But my kind of, it's a different kind of vulnerability to me. That's teaching you that this is what being a victim is, and don't accept that. This isn't acceptable for somebody to, you know, approach you and touch you in this manner. But we're not sort of saying that it's not okay to go on Instagram and post pouting photos of yourself age 10 when A, you shouldn't be on Instagram, and B, that's not appropriate, and C, you might look older, and D, you don't know who's looking. That's
And
the
that's what,
vulnerability I'm talking about. And that is left until much too late.
right,
Now,
got you.
schools are free to interpret the guidance how they want to. There are bare minimums that are meant to be taught. That's kind of the legal guidance as to what must be covered. But it's really up to schools as to how far they want to take that. So for me, I feel that some schools won't take it as far as they should do because it's controversial, for one, and it potentially causes issues with parents, the relationship between school and parents, but also it's really uncomfortable content to be delivering. And then there's this whole quandary of, if we start to talk about this that's relevant to 4 or 5 of these children, are we then sort of, well, and I don't necessarily believe this is true, but are we almost glamorizing or elevating it to children who are completely unaware of that? You know, that child who uses their iPad to play a horse game or something and never even goes on social
Oh,
media.
yeah.
I don't believe that you promote bad behaviors by talking about them personally, but if you are potentially going to be accused of kind of making young minds inquisitive about things that might not be appropriate for their age, then certainly there's an argument that somebody could make that implies that schools might be part of the problem if they talk about these issues at too young of an age. So I think there's a really fine balancing act to be achieved. Now, lots of schools at this point will have a pastoral support worker who perhaps, if adults in or around the school workforce are noticing some kind of behaviour or presentation about a specific child, that person, that pastoral support worker, hopefully, if they're skilled enough to do this sensitively, would be able to do some kind of intervention with that child just for their benefit without having to expose a full class to it. But I do still think it's worthwhile to teach children that you can make yourself vulnerable through choices you make, particularly online. And we do teach it, but we kind of skirt around that kind of sexual exploitation thing. And it's really hard to know how to do that right. But, you know, a 10-year-old boy or a 10-year-old girl is essentially the same as, or has the same opportunities an 18-year-old might have had at this point, perhaps not in the physical world, but certainly in the online arena. And that's what worries me about leaving kind of that discussion of sexual relationships until a later point. Now, primary schools can teach the mechanics of sexual reproduction, mostly it's meant to be in a scientific context. If they do, that's the intention. But some, you know, schools are free to develop their own policies that go further. Of course, the government guidance says those policies should be crafted with kind of community input, so parental input ideally. But I know a lot of schools are going to be reluctant to do that, especially if they don't legally have to, because it's just such a powder keg, really. Because, I mean, for a relatively liberal nation, if you look around, it looks like we're very open about sex. But if you actually listen to what we're prepared to talk about to one another, I'm not so sure that we are. Like, we're quite happy for our children to watch Love Island or see the kind of imagery they're seeing on Facebook. Well, not so much Facebook, perhaps, but Instagram and other websites. But we don't really talk about it. We don't say, you know, well, this person looks like that because, or this is an example of an unhealthy sexual relationship, or, you know, we don't have those open conversations, I feel, as parents with our children, or as, you know, as educators with children, because it's still sort of taboo. I think we're happy to talk around the edges of it, but not directly. And I think children really need that kind of direct modelling. So I do think there are some issues. Now, secondary is a whole different arena, really. At secondary, they can teach those and must teach those kinds of understandings between the ages of 11 and 16. So I think that's where most of the important work is being done in terms of explaining, sex as a recreational act, safe sex, not being vulnerable to exploitation, knowing what sexual exploitation looks like. But my other issue with that is, how well is that taught? Now, at primary school, your teacher is a generalist. They teach everything to you. Your teacher is, the person who delivers all of the content you ever learn, in almost every case anyway. But at secondary school, there are specialist subject teachers